Fortress on a Hill with Henri, Danny, Keagan, Jovanni, Shiloh, and Manisha.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Henri. My pronouns are he and him. Thank you for joining us today. With me are my two loving co-hosts, Jovanni and Keagan. Fellas, how are you doing?
Excellent.
Can't be better, man. Can't complain.
You're in Texas. I'm sure you could complain a lot if you really want. And joining us in the guest seat for today is Kyle Anzelone from antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute. Kyle, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, definitely. So we wanted to take some time to do a full Ukraine update for our listeners, try to talk about some of the biggest headlines that have been going on recently and the direction that the conflict is going at this time. So Kyle, I wanted to begin with the counteroffensive. What is, as far as the two sides sit today, how long has it been going on? Where each side's sitting, and then of course after that we can talk a little bit about the Wagner mutiny and what's going on with Prigozhin and that kind of thing.
So as far as I could tell with the counteroffensive, more or less the start date was about June 4th. So we are 4 weeks into it now, and Ukraine hasn't taken very much territory. They have, gained little villages here and there along the battlefield line, but it doesn't seem like, at least to my understanding, anything particularly significant, especially for the size of the losses that Ukraine has suffered. Before the invasion started, the Washington Post labeled the 47th Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine as the brigade that was going to lead the tip of the spear for Kiev. They had been equipped with Leopard tanks, Bradleys, and a whole bunch of other Western weapons. Almost the entire brigade was trained in Germany by NATO forces. They had NATO weapons. And from all reports, they were attacking in the Zaporizhia area of Ukraine and made little gains there. So, of course, anything could change. I keep reminding people that, in the fall, the Ukrainians didn't make progress for a couple of weeks before they really started to make some significant gains. Although this does look different and for a couple of reasons. Ukraine is attacked all over the front, where last time they attacked in the south and then launched a massive offensive up northeast in the Donbass region. It doesn't look like they're really have anything for that this time. And if you read the analysis of former American officers like Douglas McGregor and Daniel L. Davis, they point out that just with the number of troops and weapons that Ukraine has versus what they already had spended, there's really not this massive force in waiting to carry out some kind of big push. So it does seem that, and we are hearing now from even Western sources and from Kiev, Zelensky said the offensive isn't going as fast as they wanted, and Western sources are saying they're disappointed with the progress so far.
There were so this offensive, right, had a lot of PR behind it. There's a lot of they were like announcing it for weeks and weeks and weeks in advance, as if they were announcing it's a big event going on, just open about it. I know General Petraeus back in June 6, he predicted that the offensive is going to be like a blitzkrieg that will run through Russian defenses and will reach the Sea of Azov. And like you said, none of this is materializing. There were, before this offensive was, there were concerns from the military brass in the Ukraine military that they're saying that they feel that they weren't prepared yet, but they were being pushed to go ahead with it by the Western backers. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I do agree with you, and we certainly did see Ukraine. I believe around February was the first time we had a report from the Pentagon saying that they were helping Ukraine plan this offensive. And about at least every month, but probably more frequently during that time, Kiev constantly said, we don't have enough weapons for it. We don't have enough weapons for it. But it seemed like the West was really pushing them anyways. And it's also important to remember that during that time, there seemed to be a pretty big disagreement between Washington and Kiev about the Battle of Bakhmut as well, where Washington was saying that Kiev was expending too many of their forces, too many of their weapons in the city, and that they should just pulled out. It was a symbolic battle. Where Kiev, their defense ministry was saying that, Bakhmut was essential to the entire front. And it seems like from what we've seen since the fall of that city, that hasn't been the case. And in fact, that, Bakhmut fell, but that was just about it. It's not like Russia ran through a bunch of territory in the Donbass afterwards. So the U.S. was probably right there. But yeah, even leading up right before the offensive, they're saying they don't have enough weapons. And we know from the Discord leaks, the documents that Jat Teixeira gave us, that the West thought Ukraine was running out of air defenses. Now they have sent Ukraine a lot of air defenses in the past few weeks, or at least they have committed to it. It's always hard to tell what's actually making it to Ukraine, how fast it's making it versus what they're saying, but they're saying they're giving them a lot of air defenses. But of course, Ukraine, I'm sure, would really like to have those F-16s before they start this counteroffensive, but we know that's still probably about a year out or so from actually hitting the battlefield.
I think the one thing that has been interesting with Bakhmut is that, because we had this back and forth, or it was going on for 10 months, and the Russians were losing like 5 people for every 1 Ukrainian. So in Zelensky's mind, he was saying, this is worth it. Like, we need to stay here, even though they were losing, like they lost, I don't know exactly how many numbers, but somewhere between 17,000 and 20,000 soldiers killed in action, with many more wounded just in the battle. And so a lot of people were saying, is this worth it? Is this worth it? And it didn't seem like it. It seemed like to them, they were making a calculation that was worth it for them. But I mean, it's crazy. Just in this 16 months of the war going on, there's been over 200,000 casualties altogether, which is just insane. And it just goes to show you how deadly modern war can be for both sides. Even if you're the defender, you generally have the tactical advantage when you're the defender, but when you're not, but that's the thing with Russia. Russia has so many people to throw at these battles that it doesn't really matter to the higher ups how many people die, because they have more people to throw in the mix.
Yeah, Bakhmut was described by all sides, by everyone, as a meat grinder. Yeah. And I believe it was the Times of London reported that for Ukraine, they were essentially just pouring untrained conscripts into the Battle of Bakhmut, young men that had apparently never even fired a rifle, because when they heard the sound of rifle fire, it terrified them. And on the Russian side, they were using essentially the Wagner group for all the fighting in Bakhmut. And so I think probably both sides saw the men dying in Bakhmut as absolutely expendable. And, the numbers you give for casualties may be correct. They may be a lot higher. From my estimation, it seems that both Kiev and Moscow have every incentivized to downplay the number of men dying on their side. So I think those are probably minimum casualty counts. And, likely when this war is over, we'll find out that it's a lot higher. And also, I do wonder, like, when we look at this battlefield in particular, this is modern warfare being fought in relatively modern countries with some infrastructure. I know American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan had access to pretty good medical care, and there's, a lot of young men who suffered significantly life-altering, physical injuries, quadruple amputations, stuff like that, where, in past wars, there's no way they would have survived. And so, maybe they're getting the number of dead soldiers down so far because this war is being waged, a few hundred miles from Moscow and Kiev, where I'm sure there's top quality medical facilities for these soldiers. And so, I'm sure the injuries are absolutely horrific, especially with the amount of mining that's going on now.
One thing that's you mentioned the meat grinder. One thing that's significant here is that Ukraine is getting this hodgepodge of all these Western weapons, right? Because if you look at this conflict, right, it's not Russia's not fighting Ukraine. Russia is fighting the whole NATO, like 30 countries at the same time, right? And they're using Ukraine as foot soldiers. And you've seen this hodgepodge of modern weapons, right, given to Ukraine, just thrown at Ukraine. Leopard, like you said, Leopards, which is the version of the M1 Abrams, right? The German version, right? And you've seen all these Bradleys, and you've seen all these, the British throwing in their their equipment. You see all these weapons, right? So getting these, you're trying to get these this army, this Ukrainian army, right? Trying to be created on the spot in the middle of the war, right? Giving them weapons they're not really familiarized with, throwing them out there into the meat grinder, right? Without air support, because they don't have air superiority, right? Air superiority is Russian, right? So as they throw in, keep doing these waves, just getting destroyed. And there is no incentive to stop this meat grinder, because it's not Western troops that are getting killed. It's Ukrainian troops. So they're people say they care about Ukraine, but they don't. They just keep throwing them and throwing them and throwing them.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you said. And I guess just to add to it, I think the escalation in weapons that we've seen the West give Kiev, I'm sure some of it is because the White House has kind of taken this position where they say, okay, well, we think we're going to cross Russian red lines if we give Ukraine Et, so we're going to give them this other weapons platform. And then when Russia doesn't escalate, they say, oh, look, that means that, we're not crossing a red line, so we're free to take steps further. So, initially they're unwilling to give them the HIMARS, these rockets with a range of 50 miles. And now they're actually apparently, just today I believe the Wall Street Journal reported, they're going to give them the ATACMS, and these are the rockets for the HIMARS that have a range of 200 miles. Initially Biden's like, we can't give them F-16s. We'll be out in World War III with Russia. And now we're going to give them F-16s. And so we've seen this slow escalation. I do think a part of it is because there are people in the White House who say, look, Russia's not escalating. They're not carrying out attacks in Poland or Romania. And so that means we have a free hand. I think the other part of it, and the bigger part of it, is that's what they need to do to keep Ukraine fighting. For the West, this has not for me and you, not for anybody on this call, not for anybody, any normal person in the West, but for our elite class. They, I'm sure, have just seen this as a gigantic victory. The amount of military spending going on in the world is spiraling out of control. All these European countries are boosting their war budget by billions and billions of dollars. Poland's going to buy $15 billion in Patriot equipment. The Pentagon, the State Department just announced, and this is going on all over Europe. Just massive booms for the weapon industry. We're, the American stockpiles, we're sending all of our weapons to Ukraine. Well, those are going to have to eventually be replenished. And so the years and years to come, some of these companies are going to essentially be able to produce all the weapons they can, and the Pentagon is just going to buy them all up. And so it's been incredibly, profitable. But I really think the game here is that every time Ukraine has a major setback, the West gives them a new increase in weapons. So whether it's, Stingers and Javelins at the very beginning, it's the tanks, it's the HIMARS, it's the longer range rockets, it's the mids, it's going to be the F-16s. All these escalations, I think they're taking because they want to give Kiev more weapons to make sure that government doesn't start to think that negotiations are the better option. So keep escalating the military support for Kiev to keep its soldiers dying on the front lines, because they know that, for every Ukrainian soldier that dies, there's probably going to be a Russian or soldier or two that dies as well.
And to add to that, Kyle, you also have the this is not free, and that's the thing. This is not free. Ukraine's going to pay for it one way or another, right? This is not free, and Ukraine. And one of the things that Zelensky has been doing also, pretty much just selling off Ukraine assets to BlackRock and any other and stuff like that, because this is, they're not getting it because we're Santa Claus. You know what I'm saying? They're going to be in huge debt at the end of this.
Yeah, I usually just go off and complain about Lockheed and Raytheon because, from my perspective, that's where a lot of the corruption lies, but it's also in companies like BlackRock as well. I believe it was Peter Van Buren who recently wrote a phenomenal article in the Quincy Institute, and he explains that in Iraq and Afghanistan, we tried as a government to rebuild a nation, and here essentially what they're doing, and I'm a libertarian, so I hate using like BlackRock and saying, oh, this is a private company, because this is corruption all the way. All these companies fund the think tanks that influence U.S. policy. This isn't like a pure private company or anything like that. It lives and thrives off of government subsidies. But at the same time, Peter Van Buren points out, and I think rightfully so, that they really want to privatize the nation building effort in Ukraine and to just have all these private companies come in and do it rather than the US government trying to rebuild Ukraine. And as long as this war goes on, it's just more and more money for all these Western firms that are going to get the contracts to rebuild the infrastructure once this war hopefully eventually ends.
I was reading today about the fact that the general estimate right now is 750 billion for reconstruction efforts alone. And that's a huge money-making opportunity for all of these companies. And it sucks that they're thinking that way, but we have to acknowledge that as the reality, is that they are looking at all of this beyond just the companies like Northrop Grumman and Raytheon and Lockheed, all those other companies that are going to want to get in on reconstruction efforts once this is all done. And that's crazy that they allowed the ATACMS missiles, but I figured once the Brits gave them the Storm Shadows that have like a 550 kilometer range, that they were going to say, oh, well, the ATACMS is less, so we can give them to them now. So,
yeah. And I do understand that the US has been giving the Ukraine the JDAM ERs for sometimes, the ones with extended range. They got like drone wings on the side of them. And I was talking to somebody who was involved with the JDAM system, and he was explaining that at least this is what he believes is going on, is that the mids are equipped to be able to launch the JDAMs by using, I believe it's a missile launcher, that they put the JDAM launcher on bottom of that one to finally get it to launch. But then the planes will fly real low and then increase their altitude right before they launch them, and then they could get a pretty good, longer I believe the initial range is like 100 miles or so, but he thinks they could go a lot longer using those tactics. So again, the White House is probably sitting there going, well, we've already given them weapons with a range of over 200 miles, and Russia hasn't used a nuclear weapon, so that means we could give them a range, the ATACMS, and Russia isn't going to escalate or do anything. When I think the Russian position is, for the longer ranges that weapons that Kiev gets, the more territory of Ukraine that we're going to take. And it may take Russia years to take all that territory. They may have to, lose hundreds of thousands of their own soldiers, kill hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. But I think the Kremlin is set on that path and is fine with the losses they're going to suffer to take the territory that they feel they need to take.
Let's move on to the talk of the town this week, which was the so-called coup. It had American, media people and planners, salivating. They were just they were up in joy, the possibility of a Russian civil war. They were talking about pushing for massacres and the overthrow of Putin. You have Anne Applebaum put out an article the day, like the same. Keep in mind, it was only 24 hours, this whole crisis, right? But she put out an article there, in Atlantic, in June 24th, saying, Russian slides into civil war. Is Putin facing his Tsar Nicholas II moment, right? Meaning that, Putin's going to get overthrown, get arrested and executed. You have Reuters, talking about, what's the risk between, the Wagner mutiny, what's the risk here? If China is looking at the risk here with this deep Russian ties and whatnot, pretty much all this is about China, and you have all these people talking about. Interesting that Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone, right? He wrote something very, very comical, I think, saying that the real casualties of this civil war were the Beltway expert class. They were hoping for a massacre, they were hoping for chaos, they were hoping for destruction, everything, and nothing happened. And the only thing that was massacred and destroyed was the credibility. Your thought?
Yeah. So again, this was only a 24-hour period, and Anne Applebaum, who is not a very good writer, somehow managed to have an article out in the first few hours of this thing. So that raised some quite a few alarm bells for me. But like you said, it does show just how much the Washington Beltway class was salivating and how excited they were over this, that they all immediately rushed to Twitter, rushed to their outlets, and presented this as the most significant threat to Putin's rule yet, and all these other like catchy little phrases that they like to use when, I'm not sure that even in Prigozhin's wildest dreams that he ever really thought that he was going to end up on, you know, the seat in the Kremlin or something like that. I think this was just more about an internal dispute within the Russian military ranks. Now, it does show the dangers of using mercenary forces and why, you know, war is unpredictable, and why I'm a staunch anti-war activist. And I think, you know, you should never take your country into war because you never know what's going to happen. And, you know, a 30,000 man militia that you have armed and really, you know, given tons of battlefield experience in this war, in the Battle of Bakhmut, you do never know, like, you know, when those guys are going to turn around and maybe not try to take over the Kremlin, but extort some money from Putin. Maybe it seemed like probably the more likely goal of Prigozhin and the Wagner forces. But rather than, I think, showing a lot of weakness from Putin, I think this did show a kind of sense of strength where he was able to quietly but efficiently kind of handle this. He didn't, you know, had to come out with any big speech. There wasn't a massive crazy bombing campaign or anything like that. There's maybe a couple airstrikes in Russia. Maybe the Wagner forces shot down a couple Russian helicopters, but for the most part, this was handled pretty quietly and easily. And you know, Lukashenko brokers the deal. And I believe it was Matthew Ho who tweeted that he thought Prigozhin would take a flight out of a window of a skyscraper in a couple of months. And
Yeah.
that's kind of how I see this thing going, is that, you know, he definitely overstepped. He definitely made a mistake, and he's going to probably pay for it in a couple of months here. But for now, I think Putin's probably going to try to let this settle down. I guess the only real question left is if they're, well, I guess two. One is whether Russia will just propagandize it and say the West was behind this, or two, whether the West was actually behind this in some way. You know, I think it's possible that maybe, you know, we fed Prigozhin some information saying that Putin was planning on arresting him or killing him or something like that. Got him a little itchy, got him a little excited, and you know, that's maybe what prompted this. I'm just speculating there, but I think those kind of things are definitely possible, and you know, something that I'm sure Russia is looking into. And if there's any truth behind it, I think we should prepare to see some major escalations from Russia, and we may have already seen one of them. They carried out a strike kind of close to the front lines, and they hit some,
Kramatorsk.
yes, and you know, hit some higher ranking Ukrainian soldiers, I believe. But at the same time, it was in a very civilian area, and I'm not sure we've seen Russia carry out a ton of these strikes throughout the war. A lot of times, you know, they've targeted infrastructure. In the early war, you know, even the Pentagon was surprised at how reserved Russia's bombing campaign of Ukraine had been. It really wasn't until last September with the Kerch bridge bombing, the Nord Stream bombing, and stuff like that going on, that Russia really escalated its strikes within Ukraine. But even then, they haven't, like, for example, tried to carry out a decapitation strike on Zelensky, as far as we know. Maybe things like that are coming if the West continues to escalate.
One of the things that you mentioned, the Kramatorsk, you know, attack. You know, looking on Telegram videos and so forth, right? There were you know, there were also foreigners there. You know, Anglophone foreigners. You know, there are people with tattoos and patches from foreign armies as well in that attack as well, and as casualties being brought out. But it's a good thing that you also, something that you mentioned about that, about, you know, because one thing about Prigozhin, right? He was giving signs of being unhinged before this happened. You know, just going on social media and just going out with some rants. And he appeared to have his dispute was mostly with his one of the defense minister. That was his main dispute, and that's what he was calling out. Sergio.
Sergio.
Yeah, that was his main target. But one of the things that caught my eye from Scott Ritter, for example, he you know, listening to him, you know, doing this episode, he says that Prigozhin you know, had contact at one point with MI6 agents, either in Africa or, you know, by way of Ukrainians in Berkut, saying that Ukrainian troops, you know, and at the same time, while this was happening, this crisis, this panic was happening, Ukrainian troops took advantage of the situation, right, and just unleashed multiple attacks at different fronts, different lines, in the Russian defensive lines at the same time. you know, to try to punch a hole while this was going on, while this distraction was going on. I've seen also Scott Ritter reports that, you know, that Russia acted, or the government acted with foresight, as if it was expecting it. Immediately it shift soldiers around and clear the defensive lines, right, and also rounded up would-be terrorists in Moscow, right, you know, who were potentially planning attacks while this was going on. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you make a very good point there about that, you know, Ukraine saw this, and my guess is that Ukraine probably have foreknowledge, because apparently Washington have foreknowledge. And so my guess is that Washington, at the very least, informed Kiev, and what White House officials have said is they told Kiev not to encourage the coup within Moscow. So don't like carry out any strikes in support of the Wagner group within Russia, but at the same time to try to exploit this in Ukraine. And as you mentioned, they launched some offensives when this happened. And as far as I could tell, there weren't any significant gains. 1 or 2 villages seem to have been captured. I believe one in the Luhansk region, and maybe one in the south, although those could have already traded hands again. It's really hard to, you know, keep track of how fast these villages go back and forth and everything like that at times. But, you know, the fact that there weren't any major gains because of this does suggest that Russia was prepared. And, you know, for whatever reason, they were ready for this. Maybe it's because Prigozhin just was running his mouth over and over again. A lot of people like myself really thought that all of his protesting was likely coordinated with Putin in some way. It was some kind of psyops, just because it was hard to imagine this commander would get away with, you know, kind of talking bad about the Russian military, and, you know, demanding more and more, and kind of, you know, complaining that strategically he was stuck and that the Russian forces weren't doing enough in all of this. And I guess those were legitimate complaints. And so maybe that's why Russia was prepared. They're just like, oh, this is going to happen at some point. But it could also mean that Russia had legitimate foreknowledge and knew what was going to happen and about the time and everything like that, and was 100% ready to go.
I was reading before this just a couple hours ago that they arrested General Surovikin, who was the guy who was supposedly in charge of the Ukraine war. And they arrested him in conjunction with because of his involvement with Wagner's attempt. So we'll see, like, if he's just the first head to roll, or if there will be other ones.
Right. And look, I guess, you know, we should always consider that you know, Putin is just a government leader. He's a tyrant himself, and he may be, you know, seizing this opportunity to clean up some issues that he sees, and this is just a good thing to use to get rid of this guy. Could have been involved in it. It could have been Putin just kind of exploiting the situation. I want to see more details on it, just because it would seem to fit into the Western narrative that this was a larger plot. But at the same time, again, Putin could just try to be cleaning things up. There's a ton of corruption within the Russian military.
That's one of the reasons why they're doing so bad, is because there is this corruption at, like, we had no idea how deep it went before this war started, because everyone thought that Russia was like big and bad. And now we're seeing like that they're a paper tiger in a lot of ways, because their tactics and their doctrine is just not great. But also the fact that instead of maintaining equipment, like we would, like a lot of countries would do, they just would sell those parts or do something else with them to make money. And so it's been interesting throughout this war to see like how the corruption in their military is just really bigger than anybody even thought.
I disagree. I have an opposing opinion to that. If you look at their military budget is like $70 billion compared to our military budget is about close to $1 trillion now.
Yeah.
And with $70 billion, they're very efficient with, you know, with the way they manage their equip the military. And also the difference is that their tactics is right on their border, because in Russia's military history, most of their wars has been near border, or on their soil with, you know, Napoleon 1812, you know, the Germans in 1914, and then the Germans again in 1939. So most of the, and then the Poles in 1918. So most of their wars have been either in their country or near borders, right? Where Afghanistan, for example, during the Soviet incursion into Afghanistan, by that time Afghanistan literally bordered the Soviet Union, whereas American wars has been, we have a very inflated budget, for example, we showed to be very incompetent in Afghanistan and Iraq and whatnot. We're fighting these armies or rudimental weaponry, right? Whereas Russia right now is fighting an army equipped by first world countries, right? Very advanced, a military that was fitted to be part of NATO. They were a de facto NATO military already. A military that deployed to Iraq, and fought side by side with American soldiers. So the comparison between the American military and the Russian military, right? Cannot be made because the American military haven't fought a foe like the Ukraine, like Ukraine, and since the Second World War. So I'll disagree with that statement.
Yeah, I think you guys are probably both right, because if you look at the amount of aid that the West has given Ukraine, it is comparable to Russia's defense budget. The spending on military for the war so far has probably been pretty comparable on both sides, and it's probably hard to calculate out and everything like that exactly. But my guess is it's been pretty similar, and the Ukrainians have gotten NATO quality training and are using NATO tactics on the battlefield. They're receiving Western intelligence on targeting. And so these are very, everybody just likes to make it out to be plucky Ukraine fighting for itself against Russia. And it's the entire Western world using Ukraine as a proxy to fight a war against Russia. At the same time, I do think there was a couple of things within the Russian military, at least prior to the war. Apparently, there was about no non-commissioned officer class within the Russian military. This is something that Daniel Davis has pointed out. And so the fact that the troops weren't equipped to the level that they needed to be was likely exacerbated by this problem, because you basically just had enlisted men and then high-ranking officers, and there wasn't that level of communication to know what kind of quality the Russian army was in. And it seems that certainly the Russian army is in far better state now than it was at the beginning of the war, just judging by how it's handled the current counteroffensive compared to the last one. And then the second thing tactically was at the beginning of the war, Russia didn't have a lot of technology invested in taking out anti-personnel drones and also their own anti-personnel drones. So drones that just drop hand grenades or suicide drones like the Switchblade drones and stuff like that. Apparently, Russia didn't have a whole lot of those at the start of the war. And that's something that they've kind of studied the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict from 2020? Yeah. When the Azeris took a good chunk of Nagorno-Karabakh there. And one of the things that they really used were anti-personnel and anti-armor drones very effectively. And they used those to take out armor. They used them to take out small anti-aircraft systems that the Armenians had in place. And Russia has adopted some of these tactics. And I think it explains why they're performing far better now.
Let's move to the strategy here, the strategy of bleeding Russia. One of the things that there's a book, I don't know if you heard about it, it's called The Chronicle of a Death Foretold. It's written by a Colombian writer, right? And it'll talk about this guy that in the village that everybody knew that he was going to die, that he was going to get murdered at a certain hour. But he did, but him. Everybody in the village knew but him, right? And no one, and he'll go to, in the book, he'll go to places and he'll talk to people, and everybody, and the person he'll talk to knew that he was gonna get murdered at a certain hour, but he didn't know, right? So calling this a war foretold, right? This war was not a surprise. It was actually pushed for, right? And there is actually a RAND report back in 2019 called Extending Russia, where pretty much explained, detailed, how they're going to bait Russia into a war and how they're going to extend Russia, right, with the aim of pretty much bleeding Russia, and hopefully, right, breaking the government, the system, and balkanizing Russia, right? You saw at the beginning of the conflict, Hillary Clinton talking about the Afghan trap. You're talking about Lindsey Graham talking about that, you know, the United States has never spent more, I know spent money so well as to killing Russians. You know, you see all this coming out, you know, before the conflict, you know, and during the conflict. Yet, we still, the media still describes this conflict as unprovoked. You know, this is the unprovoked invasion by Russia, right? Where all the telltales were there, you know, years before, even back to 27, when Putin addressed the Munich conference, saying that, you know, you guys would keep pushing and pushing and pushing. You know, what's your thought?
Yeah, so I completely agree with you that this war was provoked, and it seems intentionally so. I mean, you could look all the way back to the 90s when, you know, and during the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, the U.S. promised not to expand NATO. And then, of course, during the next presidency, Clinton, they just started to expand NATO. Now, initially, I think the idea was more that from the American political class that we could basically do what we want now. Like we won the Cold War. Russia and every other country was going to be subservient to the United States. We are going to remake the world as we want it, and nobody was going to stand in our way. And it worked. They rigged Russian elections. They bankrupted Russia. For all the faults of the Soviet Union, the Russian people were far worse off in the 1990s after the Americans came in and propped up governments and looted their country than they were even under the you know, worst days of the Soviet Union. America had its way with essentially the entire world. We were on, you know, pretty good terms with China. We were, you know, doing what we could to bring China into the world economy, seeing that would benefit ours. And then also, again, you know, exploiting Russia. We were going to wars in the middle of Asia just because, you know, we could you know, throw a puny little dictator like Saddam Hussein up against the wall and show him that we mean business. But then I think you are right that as time goes on, especially after 2014, where you had the coup in Ukraine, which, you know, so obviously was going to provoke a Russian reaction, and yet the entire Washington political class had a collective panic attack when Russia took I think, very calculated step to annex the Crimean Peninsula, seeing that their base at Sevastopol, their very critical Black Sea fleet, was under danger because of the coup that America had pulled in Ukraine and the new government that was coming in. And not only that, the new government was anti-Russia to the core, and you know, in a like just overtly racist way, you know, banning the Russian language, banning Russian movies. You know, one thing I like to remind people is that when Zelensky made his famous show, Servant of the People, it's in Russian because at the time Zelensky spoke Russian. And at the time he put out, around the same time he put out a movie. Apparently it's a pretty average rom-com called Love in the Big City 2, but this was actually banned in Ukraine because the movie was in Russian and not Ukrainian. And there was a limit on how many movies produced in Russian could be shown in Ukraine. And so that one didn't get a license. And so, you know, we had these really serious laws. But I think, as you point out, this RAND study in 2019, the American political establishment starts to get a little bit antsy that they have pushed Russia and China together. That they had been so hostile to both governments. They had crossed so many red lines with both governments. And Putin and Xi had become close friends. You know, they celebrated birthdays together. They were, you know, Russia and China were moving closer and closer together. I remember 2018 and 2019, Ray McGovern was screaming in his articles every week, what are you doing? Can't you see that you're pushing Russia and China closer together? And Biden was going to Moscow telling Putin, you can't trust Xi. Well, Putin thinks, I can't trust you. I could trust the Chinese. I know what's going on there. And so I do think that's where we get this RAND report, where they have all these ways of taking down Russia. So pulling off coups in Belarus and Kazakhstan, giving weapons to Ukraine, holding significant NATO war games in Ukraine, making sure that Ukrainians know how to fight along, NATO soldiers know how to use NATO tactics, know how to use NATO weapons. There were, you know, American and British ships sailing just a couple miles from the Russian coastline in Crimea, All this was to intentionally provoke Russia into a war with the idea that they needed to bleed Russia. So whenever we're ready to fight the next war with China, China can't rely on Russia. I mean, it sounds so cynical and so stupid that we just wouldn't find a way to get along with the two other, large militaries on Earth. I still think that United States stands out, as a superpower above Russia and China. However, these two countries now are establishing their own spheres of influence, and rather than just accepting that, look, China gets a major say what happens in the South China Sea and with Taiwan, what happens in Tibet and things like that. The U.S. is saying that no, that's absolutely unacceptable. We dictate where everything happens in the world, and that means that the Black Sea, the Pacific Ocean are nothing more than American lakes. And China and Russia see that as absolutely acceptable. And the more the U.S. pushes that, the more it pushes those two countries together.
Not to mention that we've built bases, or are building bases, all along the South China Sea in Philippines and and other areas around them. And so we do that, and then so that when something does happen, if it does happen, we can say, oh no, we were attacked, where it's like really we're the ones that are creating the bigger issue.
Will Taiwan, you mentioned China, will Taiwan be the next Ukraine?
That's certainly what the Washington foreign policy establishment, I think, wants to see. They've talked about turning Ukraine to a massive Taiwan to a massive arms depot. At the same time, I do think it's a very different situation. You're talking about crossing a land border versus crossing a 80-mile body of water straight. That's far more tactically complicated to do. Of course, the situation with Taiwan could start out with a Chinese blockade of the island, and if America chooses to respond to that militarily, then that's how the war escalates. But I just think that Beijing is going to look at different options here, and due to the economic supremacy that Beijing has, it has different options, I think. And so I don't necessarily see it going that way, but I definitely think it could. And if Washington would say push Taiwan to declare independence, then it will. So certainly Washington could push us in that direction if they choose to. I think Beijing is going to work a little bit harder than Putin did in Russia to avoid that line. And again, Xi, I think, has just more non-military weapons in his arsenal than Putin did.
Absolutely. I tend to absolutely. Different scenario, different tactical situation, different facts on the ground. Going back to Russia, right? And Belarus. Recently, Belarus, Russia stationed some tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, correct? Lukashenko was talking about in one of his statements. He was saying that they were monitoring, the Belarusian military was monitoring amassing Polish soldiers amassing near Belarus, right? Once those tactical nuclear weapons landed in Belarus, right, pretty much the Polish military kind of stand down, right? Implying that the Polish were about to open a front in Belarus, right? Recently, a Russian academic named Sergei Karaganov, right, said that Russia should consider a tactical nuclear strike on a Western European city, just to enforce itself, right? Could this get nuclear anytime soon? What's your thoughts?
I don't think Russia is anywhere near there yet. I think Lukashenko tends to be a bit of a loudmouth. And my guess is that even if those weapons are in Belarus, that Putin has absolute and 100% control over them. And so it would be on Putin to decide whether they're used or not Lukashenko. And if I was just reading some statements by Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, yesterday, and he's saying that, look, the chance of nuclear war has escalated, but neither side wants to use nukes. And I do think that is pretty firmly the Russian position at this point. My guess is that the Kremlin assesses that if they use nuclear weapons, then all bets are off on what the West does. And I don't think that Putin is a suicidal leader any more than Kim Jong-un in North Korea is. And I think they probably would both make the same assessment that using nukes would have to be an absolute last ditch, move, because the chances are that the West escalates and that the, civilization is just over at that point. No more Russia, no more United States, maybe a few million people here and there in the world end up living. At the same time, I'm not surprised to hear more Russian thinkers make that point, because in Washington, the absence of a Russian nuclear warhead going off is basically a green light for everybody in the White House to do whatever they want to Russia. And that's the really difficult position that the Biden administration is putting the Putin administration in, is it doesn't seem that there's anything else Russia could do to show that it has red lines and that the West has crossed them. I am an optimist, I will say. So if I really thought that, we were at a point where Russia was seriously considering nuclear weapons, I don't know what I would be doing, but I will admit that if even if that was likely, I would probably, come on here and say, I really don't think so at this point, just because I would probably be doing everything in my power to read between the lines to find the positive statements that say we're not going to nuclear war, just because it's so unthinkable. It's so unthinkable how many people would die and how there's no benefit to anyone. And again, especially because I don't see any way that a Russian nuclear bomb is detonated and the West interprets that as okay, we really went too far, not as, all right, it's time for us to start launching our nukes. Let's see those big explosions, boys. And I'm worried that there are some people in Washington who do believe they could win a nuclear war against Russia. And so not that they could, but that doesn't mean that they won't try.
Let me ask you about PSYOP, right? PSYOP here and abroad, right? So one of the biggest losers here, right, apart from Ukraine in this conflict is Western Europe. Western Europe was forced to decouple from Russia. Russia has been for a long time the main supplier of fuel. So they've been decoupled from that. One of the reasons that the Nord Stream was blown up, which was a joint venture, actually, it was a joint venture between Germany and Russia, right? It was blown up, to keep Germany on our side and not to be tempted to deal with Russia and whatnot. We have a Green Party or Progressive Party in Germany. Germany was the center of European economy. Now they're like in a recession now, and this supposedly progressive government in Germany are very gun-ho about going to war with Russia. How do you explain this? This PSYOP going, people going against their interests here in the United States. How this war has been presented. It's been presented in a way it's been framed in a way to animize, to motivate more liberal and progressive people, more so than conservative people, in my opinion. They're more the liberals and it's been pretty much framed for them. And the global South, for example, they're reduced to threats. They're threatened because they're not going along, so they're being threatened. Whereas in Europe they're being persuaded to go against their own interest. How do you see this PSYOP? How do you understand this PSYOP going on here in this three-dimensional area?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, right? Because the West presents this, and our elected leaders present this as Russia against the world. And then when Biden explains, so everybody focuses on this gaffe that Biden has, where he says the war isn't going well for Putin in Iraq rather than Ukraine. But I think the second part of that statement is far more embarrassing. He says Russia is being isolated in the world. And then he says there's NATO in Japan in about 40 countries total. And so really what Biden is saying is that the US, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and maybe a couple more small countries here and there support what the US is doing with their proxy war in Ukraine, and that's it. And yet it's presented to the American people as, again, it's the world against Russia, when that isn't the case. It's almost the entirety of the global South. Like if you draw a line around the equator and take the south half of the globe, almost none of those countries have sanctioned Russia in any way. Have South Africa is still looking at having Putin come visit for the BRIT summit. Putin is not isolated in the world. So that's just a lie. The West has been able, or I guess Washington has been able to whip almost all of its Western allies into line. We see Turkey resisting somewhat. We see Hungary resisting somewhat. Israel hasn't completely complied with what the U.S. wants to do. In the very beginning, Naftali Bennett actually tried to end the war. So, but largely the West has been able to get their own people in line on this. And I think it's just being a part of the club, right? For the elites, it's probably got some social pressures on it where you're not going to get invited to all the fancy dinners if you're Viktor Orban rather than being Liz Truss or whoever the UK prime minister happens to be. The more hawkish you are, the more you get invited in. I will say there has been some resistance. Macron in France has said a couple times that we should look at handling this a different way or something like that. It's just Washington leads NATO, and Washington wants this. Britain also really, really wants this, and then the Eastern European countries. And while they're small, and while they shouldn't be the ones driving policy, they certainly are in a lot of ways at this point.
So, Kyle, where's the anti-war movement? Where are people protesting this conflict? Where are they?
Well,
I'm sorry, let me finish. The reason I ask you this because recently you write for the antiwar.com, right? Mm-hmm. Which I came across antiwar.com while I was still in active duty and at the early stage of the Iraq War, because I was opposed from the beginning of the Iraq War, and I was looking for resources, and antiwar.com was one of the resources that I found away from the mainstream media. So I appreciate your organization, to keeping us informed. And what I've noticed with antiwar.com is that, you guys have been pretty consistent, whereas some of these early media, kind of flopped and flipped and whatnot, depending who's the new enemy of the day, But recently there was Rage Against the War Machine, right? February 20, this year, February 2023. Antiwar.com was an endorser of that event. It was an event put together by the Libertarian Party and the Movement for People's Party, which was a movement that came after the Bernie fiasco. They were originally Bernie supporters, and then they kind of broke away and formed their own parties. But this event got strong online opposition from liberals, progressive, and libertarians too. And it seems to be absent. Like $100+ billions of dollars and thousands of lives being lost and everything. Meanwhile, people here in the United States are struggling. Where is the anti-war movement?
Yeah, unfortunately, there really hasn't just been a very strong anti-war movement in the U.S. in a couple of decades now. You really got to go back to the Iraq War to see anything substantial and meaningful. Thanks for praising antiwar.com. We do try to be consistent and to make sure we're up to date on everything and getting these things right. And I think we largely have on the war in Ukraine. But there is this kind of seems to be thing that happens, right, where it's in the libertarian movement. We have the Cato Institute, and these are supposed to be libertarians, but you have to at the very least be supportive of sanctioning Russia and completely condemning Russia in every single article you write about the war in Ukraine to have a job there, or else you simply won't. And then on the other side, you have like a group like our outlet like The Nation, which again is to establishment, is just fallen away. These were outlets that you could at Speds, maybe not like outright anti-war articles, but certainly articles that either represent a more realist perspective or were skeptical of the mainstream war narrative. And now they've just taken on and completely support and endorse the narrative about the war in Ukraine. So as I don't want to say weak as the anti-war movement was, but really as weak as the anti-war movement was going into 2022, it's only experienced more fractures. And I think unfortunately we have this thing going on in American politics right now where basically you have to agree with somebody on everything or you might as well agree on nothing. And so what I saw a lot of from these establishment voices, whether it's, you know, the more progressives but still establishment Democrats or the more conservative but still establishment Republicans, was they would, you know, point out one person on the other side and say, oh, you're going to, you know, be involved with a group that believes X, Y, they'll point out libertarians aren't good enough on like civil rights or gay rights or something like that. And, oh, how can you possibly be involved with those people? Or, you know, they'll look at libertarians and they'll say, well, these people, you know, believe in completely redistributing wealth and, you know, expanding the welfare state and all these other things. How can you agree with those people? And that really does create a situation where everybody is uncomfortable with, you know, forming these larger coalitions because you're worried that you're going to share the stage with somebody who's going to get you canceled, even if you don't know all the people you're speaking with. And so it's really hard. I was actually this past weekend, I spent some time with some members of the Libertarian Party, like the national board, and I was talking to them about how much work and effort it took to put this event together, because there were so many times where, people are just trying to call and get the event canceled based on this person or that person's appearance. And there's like trying to balance that all out and get one of these events to work is so hard that at this point in the US, it's hard to get a few thousand anti-war voices out in one place at one time. It's really unfortunate, and something has to change, or else we're absolutely doomed. We're never going to rein this in, and we're going to end up in nuclear war with Russia or China or hell, North Korea at this point, because they seem to really just poke Kim and have no concept whatsoever that maybe at some point you have to talk to Pyongyang or treat the North Koreans like they're mildly adults with like their own ability to, you know, make choices for their country. But the Biden administration won't do that. So we're in a lot of trouble, and we really need an anti-war coalition to come. Maybe something could happen that'll cause a groundswell of support and rallying together. You know, one of the issues that has really been on the back burner for everybody over the past 4 or 5 years has been Assange's case. And in part, it's understandable that while the war in Ukraine is going on, that day to day, most of us are screaming about the war in Ukraine, billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives. But at the same time, this was a part of the Rage Against the War Machine platform. I know it's a big issue for the Libertarian Party, and that is the freedom of Julian Assange. And so not that I in any way want him to be extradited to the US, but maybe an event like that would be a rallying cry that would bring the anti-war movement together, and in a way where we're willing to set aside some of our differences and we're not worried about being on the stage with somebody who is a no person and who we can't associate with. I don't know. I'm grasping for straws, I feel like, a little bit in how this anti-war movement is really going to come together. There are increasingly skeptical voices on the right and the left about this. Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Unfortunately, it's just only, it's just Russia. They're bad on China then. They're like, oh, we need to end the Cold War with Russia and Ukraine so we could fight the Cold War against China and Taiwan. And that's not an improvement. That's not better. That's not anti-war.
I think this is a good point to pause here. Keagan, you have any last marks?
Oh, I too wish that we can come together on the things that we agree on, like being against war, because this war has shown how devastating modern war can be, and how the people's voices get lost in a lot of the analysis and a lot of the talk that goes on. It's when you're talking about war, it can get really top heavy in a lot of ways. And so I do hope that we can come together and realize all war is not helpful for humanity if we want to get better.
Yeah, and there are a lot of bright spots. The Rage Against the War Machine rally was obviously one. At antiwar.com, we don't only publish libertarians. For years. One of the co-hosts of this show or previously, Danny Shergen, who's a leftist, was our lead writer at antiwar.com, a site run by libertarians, because as long as you're espousing libertarian ideas, we don't care. And I know you guys are like that. I know I got a lot of good friends like Misty Winston, who just constantly works tirelessly to make sure that people on the right and the left are getting to know each other. And I use that very, very loosely, the right and the left, but libertarians and leftists are getting to know each other. And look, if we become friends, then look, and then somebody's like, oh, Keagan, you can't associate with that guy. I was like, look, I've done podcasts with Keagan. I know he's a cool guy. I'm not going to listen to you on that. And so those kind of things I really do think will make a difference. And maybe over time we could start to really build this coalition, because it needs to happen. It needs to happen a lot faster than it's happening, but it does need to happen eventually.
I tend to agree. I agree with both of you. Thank you for coming, Kyle. You're it was a treat to have you on, and you to share your expertise and your knowledge with us. Keagan, thank you guys, and thank you guys for listening to Forges on the Hill. Take care. Bye.
Money is tight these days for everyone, especially in the lingering shadow of COVID. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that, and for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, James O'Barr, James Higgins, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Ren Jacob, Rick Coffey, Scott Spalding, Spooky Tooth, and the Status Quo podcast. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. We're on Twitter and on Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
Come on, you good people, and listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not